Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. Back with some more vibes for, we're going to go into the fourth installment of Simón Bolivar. I don't know why I say it like that. I'm Mr. Giant, by the way, and this one is called Defeat is Not Surrender. So let's get into this and see what old Simón is up to now.
Again, Simón Bolívar retreated to New Granada to reignite the revolution. But New Granada was not the place Bolívar had left it. The state had fatally fractured. Much of the country was controlled by a man who had violently opposed Bolívar's expedition to Venezuela. The two came into conflict. Bolívar's ragged army was not allowed to rest or resupply. The situation got desperate, escalated, and then word came. The unthinkable had happened. The British had kicked Napoleon out of Spain. The reinstated Spanish king set to putting his empire in order and sent thousands of Spanish veterans fresh from the Napoleonic Wars to crush the Granadan Revolution. Split and disunited as they were, weakened by previous losses, the Republican forces stood no chance. Disarmed and penniless, Bolívar made his escape to Jamaica, where he would spend the next 2 years. But there, his previous ideas would return to him with renewed force. He would look back on the disasters and the bloodshed and decide two things. First, that no one nation would find its independence alone. Independence for Venezuela would not only require independence for all Spanish America, but the formation of one great state that could rival Spain. And second, that to do so, he must also get rid of internal divides. The fact that the Creoles, the Africans, the mixed-race population, and the Native Americans were all at one another's throat made any revolution impossible. It made any attempt to form a republic descend into anarchy and civil war. But his reverie was disturbed by an attempt on his life. His manservant, in the dead of night, crept into his room and stabbed over and over and over again the man sleeping in his hammock. Only the vicissitudes of fortune had placed another man there that night, Bolívar's former paymaster. He had journeyed to see Bolívar, and upon not finding him home, lay down to rest, only to be mortally mistaken for his boss.
Wow.
But though he had dodged death, this was enough for Bolívar. He knew he had to leave Jamaica. This time he made his way to Haiti, where he at last found the support he couldn't raise anywhere else. But it came with a price. Haiti had been a slave colony. It had become free through its own revolution, won by slaves who rose up and declared the land their own. Now their president offered to arm Bolívar if he would set the slaves of Spanish America free. Bolívar neither denied the help nor dismissed the idea. And so he started again to marshal a force for an invasion of the mainland, drawing to him all sorts of wild characters, adventurers and die-hard patriots, the wildest of all perhaps being Gregor MacGregor, a Scotsman who brought to the fray those mightiest Scottish weapons of war, the kilt and the bagpipes. War was on. Or, well, no, it wasn't, because Bolívar made a slight detour with his entire fleet to pick up one of his mistresses. But after that, yes, the war was on.
Oh, he's bringing his mistress to war and thing. These people were tripping back then.
Bolivar certainly did it here. His forces squandered and in disarray, soon he found himself fleeing back to Haiti, leaving what little of his country that wasn't in royalist hands in the hands of warlords. But he had lived up to his promise. He had proclaimed freedom for all slaves, and so Pétion, the president of the Haitian Republic, welcomed him back and offered to arm him once again. Bolivar's force was small, but this time he learned. This time he knew that rather than simply focusing on the big cities, he had to win the countryside. And so he drew his remaining revolutionary friends to his side, and with his proclamation of liberation, he drew in former slaves who had once been his enemies. But perhaps most surprising and most important, the leader of the Legion of Hell had died, and the new leader of these Plains horsemen saw more benefit in aligning his forces with the new, more egalitarian revolutionaries than with the Spanish. And while his horsemen were winning victories, Bolivar saw an opportunity. In the rainy season, long after campaigning would normally come to a halt, in a move reminiscent of nothing so much as Hannibal's crossing the Alps, Bolivar decides to take those men who would follow him and cross the Andes into New Granada. The trek is brutal. Vicious wind whips at them, food is scarce, men and horses freeze to death. But in July, the middle of South American winter, his forces appear from out of the mountains, gaunt and sallow but alive and ready to fight. With every step through the countryside, Bolivar raised more men, for New Granada had been independent for 6 years and hadn't had the revolution beaten out of it the same way Venezuela had. And so, with his ranks growing, he moved toward the lightly defended capital of Bogota. The enemy was taken by complete surprise. Spanish forces were scattered. There was almost no garrison at the capital, and no force blocking the path from Bolivar's unexpected entry point into the country of Bogota.
Wow.
So the Spanish forces raced toward the capital in an effort to get there before Bolivar's army. But Bolivar moved to intercept them, even though his force was much smaller, and the men he had that weren't exhausted from the journey over the mountains were woefully undertrained. But his speed and tenacity won again, and in battle after battle, he overtook and surprised Spanish forces, crushing the Spanish will to fight. At last, he captured Bogota. The Spanish viceroy had fled, and he'd been in such a hurry to escape Bolivar's onrushing army that he'd left the treasury behind and the armory stocked. Bolivar, at last, had the resources he needed to wage the campaign that he had always envisioned. Some time ago, he had given in to the democratic clamor of the people and had at last established a Congress. Now he summoned them to the recaptured capital. He wanted to set in motion the first part of his bold plan. He called on them to establish the nation of Gran Colombia. And so, on the 17th of December, 1821, Gran Colombia was formed. Gran Colombia would be a state large enough and powerful enough to maintain its independence. It would combine New Granada, Venezuela, and Quito, which we now roughly know as Ecuador, into one massive nation, capable of securing its liberty forever. There was only one minor problem with this plan. At the time, the Spanish still controlled Venezuela, Quito, and about half of New Granada. But Bolivar was never one to sweat the details, and so set about marshaling troops to make his invented nation a reality. Luckily for him, almost simultaneously, a revolt flared back up in Spain, weakening the king's ability to reinforce his American colonies and pulling Spanish attention away from colonial affairs. With this news, one of Bolivar's great enemies, the Captain General of Venezuela, the man who had been called in to so violently and brutally put down the colonial revolt and reestablish Spanish rule, asked to be recalled and left the Americas forever. One by one, the rats were leaving the ship. And so, at last, Bolivar once again swept
on the verge of Venezuela.
But for the first time in his life, he was leading a larger, better armed force than that he faced. And this time, his men carried with them a sense of victory. A sense that was realized at the Battle of Carabobo on the 24th of June, 1821. Bolivar had caught the Royalists on the road from Valencia. It was to be the decisive fight. The Spanish drew up and pushed the Republican forces hard. The line wavered, but the British Legion held firm, and the rest of the Republicans regained their confidence. Then Bolivar's cavalry swung in. The band of horsemen the Royalists had with them simply vanished from the battlefield. The loyalties of the local horsemen had long since changed, and Bolivar's lancers tore through the Spanish line. Soon it was over. Spanish power had been broken. The last Royalists wouldn't be pushed out for 2 more years, but with the victory at Carabobo, Venezuela finally, truly became free. But Gran Colombia wasn't done yet. Quito had been undergoing a slow and grinding revolutionary campaign for about a year, and it looked to be at somewhat of a stalemate. The men, material, and supplies of Gran Colombia were about to change all that. Yes, Bolivar was sending someone else weapons and troops. Revolution indeed. By the middle of 1822,
Wow.
in a dramatic battle 3,500 feet above sea level, the question of Quito was decided. Here too the Spanish were repulsed, and here too the local populace overwhelmingly proclaimed their desire to join Gran Colombia. But Bolivar's work was not done. The Royalists still had a stronghold on the continent. They still held the territory of Peru. Bolivar quickly got himself declared dictator of Peru, which is a little awkward because he's already president of Gran Colombia, but hey, why let your current job as a democratic head of state get in the way of a good dictatorship? As such, he galvanized the efforts to throw off foreign monarchy in the country. Then he fell dreadfully ill. The army was plagued with revolts and counter-revolts. Large sections of the fighting force changed sides and then changed sides again. But as the disturbances in Spain grew and the king rolled back all the policies made by its short-lived constitutional government and declared his power absolute, it only further fractured the royalist cause in Peru. This wasn't lost on Bolivar, who, while recovering, started another campaign against the royalists, knowing full well that, with access to the resources of his newly formed Gran Colombia, all he had to do was wear the remaining forces down. It all came to a head when he had a large royalist force contained in the mountains. The royalist position was supremely defensible, but Bolivar knew that they didn't have the supplies to survive in the mountains long, so all he had to do was wait. And wait he did, until the royalists finally attacked out of desperation. But the very things that made their position so good for defense hampered their every move. Their units were raked with gunfire as they tried to clamber down the mountainside. Their unit cohesion was disrupted. Order was hard to maintain. As the sun passed its zenith, the royalist viceroy was captured. It was clear their lines were starting to disintegrate. Terms were offered, terms were accepted. Peru, too, was now free. Join us next time as Bolivar offers to bring Peru into Gran Colombia, and with the war over, the real work of state building begins.
See, I knew of Simón Bolivar, but I didn't realize the magnitude of what he accomplished down there. No, that stuff was brutal too. But I could understand why they thought about him there, because that's like a major part of South American history there. But anyway, man, I hope you guys enjoyed this here. I'm enjoying this series. Hope you are too. And I'll leave a link in the description for this, as usual. You understand what I'm saying? In the meantime, Mr. Giant say, take care of each other.